As with the philosophers we've already covered, Socrates is something of an enigma. All the information we have about him is second-hand and highly disputed in terms of its quality, from the many dialogues of Plato to the satirical plays of Aristophanes. But this does not dispute the fact that Socrates is the spiritual father of philosophy, and his execution at the hands of the Athenian state is the foundation of the academic discipline of philosophy in general. Now, an episode dedicated to the thought of Socrates would be difficult, nigh on impossible. This is because the only source we have for Socrates' thinking is Plato, and it's widely accepted among scholars that the Platonic representation of Socrates was something of a device for Plato to espouse his own ideas. The scope of this episode will be to navigate the problem of Socrates to shed some light on Socrates' key, original contributions to the history of philosophy. For our purposes, in trying to see the evolution of Western thought, we ought to turn to Plato as our source for Socrates, despite the problematic of such an approach. There are two other sources who are widely considered as contributing to the image of Socrates: Xenophon, the historian who served in the military alongside Socrates, and Aristophanes, the aforementioned playwright. His portrayal of Socrates in his play Clouds was less than favourable, painting Socrates as a subversive figure with a flagrant disregard for Athenian democracy and customs. However, Plato produced his philosophical works in the form of dialogues, whereby Socrates engaged in discussion and argument with other figures in the Athenian scene, and other thinkers from friends to politicians. The dialogues Ion, Lysis, Euthydemus, Meno, Menexenus, Theaetetus, Euthyphro, Symposium, Apology, Crito, Phaedo, and Parmenides are thought to be occasions where Plato himself had access to the discussions taking place, although he does state he was not present for Socrates' execution. That said, it's unlikely that Plato recorded the events and discussion between Socrates and his interlocutors exactly as they happened, and so forms what is known by both historians and philosophers as the problem of Socrates. For how much of what Plato wrote is what Socrates said, or how much of it is embellished? For example, it's thought that Plato was around 25 when Socrates was executed. This means that the dialogue which feature a young Socrates would have been based on events that took place when Plato was either an infant or not even born at all. But let's reiterate that for our purposes, which are purely philosophical, we shall stick with Plato's account, despite its problems. The problem of Socrates still holds, though, because now we have to account for the fact that we find Socrates arguing different positions over the course of different dialogues, using different argumentative methods, and even arguing against himself. This is evident in Parmenides, where Socrates attacks the theory of the forms, which we shall come to when we cover Plato, whereas in the Republic, Symposium, and Phaedo, Socrates is seen to develop such a theory. These inconsistencies between dialogues have led some to conclude that they are not really a problem, because Plato is taken to be an exceptional writer, and all of these inconsistencies are perfectly intentional, representing the ambiguity in the topics of philosophy themselves. This approach takes each dialogue as its own standalone entity, with no cross-referencing between each other. This approach advises those that wish to seek a consistent picture of Socrates' character to look to the dialogues individually for literary conventions and devices that will reveal Socrates' actual personality. In knowing more about the person of Socrates, the hope is that we will be in a better position to understand what he thought versus what Plato thought. One attempt at doing just this came in the 1950s, in the work of Gregory Vlastos, a Greek philosopher who thought that a set of mutually supportive premises could give us a framework for pursuing Socratic thought as distinct from Platonic thought. This proceeds as follows. Plato held philosophical doctrines, and Plato's doctrines developed over the period in which he wrote. It is possible to determine reliably the chronological order in which the dialogues were written and to map them to the development of Plato's views. Plato puts into the mouth of Socrates only what Plato himself believes at the time he writes each dialogue. When we apply Vlastos's criteria to a reading of the dialogues, we can salvage a handful of ideas and techniques that were likely original to Socrates and not the result of the character of Socrates being Plato's mouthpiece. The first of these is the Elenchus. This is the model of questioning Socrates is portrayed as using in Plato's dialogues. Socrates would question his interlocutor, expecting them to answer honestly with what they believe. The questions typically take the form of what is X, for example, what is virtue. The aim is for Socrates to continually press his interlocutor on his beliefs until he is forced to accept something he didn't previously believe, or until the foundations of his beliefs becomes more untenable. Definition. Socrates accepts answers to his questions on 3 criteria. 1. The generality requirement, that the answer is not just an example of, say, virtue, but is something that belongs to all virtuous things. 2. The exclusion requirement, the answer does not point to something that is not virtuous. And 3. The explanatory requirement, it actually explains the thing in question, for example, virtue. There's the priority of definition. Socrates seems to value clear definition above all else for 2 reasons. One must know what virtue is before one could hope to know of any particular action that is virtuous, and one must know what virtue is before one could possibly know what kind of properties virtue has. This leads me to the next, the Ontology of Virtue. For the ancient Athenians, virtue was a sort of personal excellence that inevitably leads to success in life. Socrates believed that being virtuous was good for the soul, in the same way that being healthy is good for the body. For Socrates, being virtuous is being the kind of person that can do what is right by resisting what is wrong. Wrong actions damage one's character, leading to a degradation in the soul. Thus, pursuing things that are good for the soul is of the utmost importance. Socrates often shamed Athenians into taking seriously pursuits of virtue. Eudaimonia. Eudaimonia translates roughly from ancient Greek as happiness or the good life. This is a life led by pursuing what is virtuous and avoiding what is base. Socrates seems to be the first thinker to espouse the idea that the pursuit of the good life is the right thing to do. In other words, it is an ethical pursuit. Techne. Techne is that which can be learned and taught. Socrates, at least in some places, seems to think that virtue is a kind of techne, something that can be taught by experts in living well. Similarly, when someone fails at living well, it is down to a lack of knowledge, and the individual merely has to learn more about how to live the good life. Lastly, there's Akrasia. Akrasia is the term for weakness of the will. This is when someone who knows what is right does something wrong in order to find pleasure or under the influence of temporary states like emotions or passion. The virtuous agent has control over these aspects of their person. The master of the good life will not succumb to base pleasures. For Socrates, the expert in eudaimonia would never be overcome by passion. Therefore, when people do succumb to akrasia, it is a lack of knowledge which is the cause. People simply do not know enough about the virtues to control their will. Despite being able to pull these ideas out of the dialogues after careful analysis, one thing remains true. The problem of Socrates has not disappeared and will likely never be solved. But the Socratic influence on philosophy as a whole is utterly undeniable. His method of questioning remains relevant, his ideas on the good life carried through to Aristotle and as a result into Christian thought. Therefore, a lot of our moral thinking regarding stifling of the passions in favour of more virtuous pursuits owes itself to Socrates. Whatever may be the case about the character of Socrates and how much of it is invention, Socrates gives us valuable insight into the historical Athens and set philosophy off on a path that would change its direction forever.